In January of 1968, America did not look like a nation on the brink, but it was prosperous, powerful, confident on the world stage. The post-war decades had brought rising incomes, expanding suburbs, and the steady belief that tomorrow would be better than today. Yet beneath that confidence, there was strain. The war in Vietnam had already claimed thousands of American lives. Civil rights legislation had passed, but the struggle for equality was far from settled. On college campuses and in city neighborhoods, voices were growing louder, questioning authority, questioning tradition, questioning the direction of the country itself. Still, as the new year began, few could have imagined what the next 12 months would bring. The shocks did not arrive all at once. They came in waves. In late January, during the Lunar New Year in Vietnam, a massive coordinated assault would shatter official assurances about progress in the war. Images from distant battlefields would enter American living rooms with a new immediacy. In April, a single rifle shot in Memphis would silence a leader who had become the moral voice of a movement and ignite unrest in cities across the nation. In June, another gunshot, this time in Los Angeles, would extinguish a campaign built on unity and hope. By summer, the divisions were no longer subtle. They were visible in the streets of Chicago, broadcast to the world in black and white. Protesters and police facing one another, shouts echoing through city blocks, and in the midst of it all, a sitting president would step aside. It is easy, in hindsight, to see 1968 as a turning point. But for those who lived through it, the year unfolded slowly, month by month, headline by headline. There was no single moment when America felt it had changed. There was simply a growing sense that something familiar was slipping. AWA, shared confidence, shared story, a shared belief in where the nation was headed. How did one year carry so much weight? And why, more than half a century later, does 1968 still feel unfinished? To understand that year is to understand a moment when America did not collapse, but cracked. And once a nation begins to question itself, it is never quite the same again. By January of 1968, the war in Vietnam had already become a constant presence in American life. Each evening, families gathered around their television sets and listened to casualty counts read in measured tones. Newspaper headlines spoke of troop movements, bombing campaigns, and body counts. There was a grim rhythm to it all. More than 500,000 American troops were stationed in Vietnam. President Lyndon Johnson and his advisors maintained that the strategy was working. They spoke of progress, of attrition, of an enemy slowly weakening. For a time, many Americans accepted that explanation. Then, in the early hours of January 30th, during the Vietnamese New Year holiday known as Tet, that sense of steady progress was abruptly shaken. In a sweeping and coordinated assault, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched attacks on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. Provincial capitals were struck. Military installations were hit. Even the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon, considered one of the most secure locations in the country, came under attack. The images were immediate and startling. Gunfire in the streets of cities that had been described as secure. Smoke rising from urban neighborhoods. American soldiers scrambling to regain control of areas once thought safe militarily. The offensive would ultimately fail for the North Vietnamese. U.S. and South Vietnamese forces repelled the attacks and inflicted heavy casualties. But war is not measured only by territory gained or lost. It is measured by perception. For years, Americans had been told that the enemy was losing strength. That victory, though costly, was approaching. The scale and audacity of the Tet Offensive told a different story. If the enemy could strike with such force and coordination, how close was victory? Truly, Television played a decisive role. Unlike previous wars, Vietnam was broadcast into living rooms across the nation. Viewers saw wounded Marines carried through the mud. They saw firefights in city streets. They saw a South Vietnamese police chief execute a prisoner at close range, an image that would linger in the national conscience. The war no longer felt distant. It felt immediate. In February, Walter Cronkite, widely regarded as one of the most trusted journalists in America, returned from Vietnam and offered a sober assessment on national television. He suggested that the war might end not in victory, but in stalemate. For many viewers, his words carried profound weight. President Johnson is said to have remarked privately, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Whether or not the quote was exact, the sentiment captured a deeper truth. Public confidence was slipping. Polls showed growing opposition to the war. College campuses saw larger protests. Parents of draft-age sons watched developments. With mounting anxiety, the phrase, "credibility gap," entered public conversation. Quiet acknowledgement that the assurances from Washington no longer matched what Americans were seeing with their own eyes. It was not that the nation suddenly turned against the war overnight. Rather, a slow erosion began, a sense that the conflict might not be winnable in the way it had been described, a sense that sacrifice might not lead to clear resolution. By the end of winter, something fundamental had shifted. The United States remained powerful. Its military remained formidable, but the certainty that had sustained the war effort was fractured. And in a democracy, certainty is fragile. As spring approached in 1968, the country was already uneasy, questioning the path forward in Vietnam. Then, on an April evening in Memphis, Tennessee, a single gunshot would deepen that unease into something far more personal. The year was only beginning. Asterisk, by the spring of 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had already carried the weight of a movement for more than a decade. He had stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. He had faced jail cells, threats, and relentless criticism. He had helped push through landmark legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But in 1968, his focus had widened. He was no longer speaking only about desegregation. He was speaking about poverty, about economic justice, about the dignity of working people. He had begun organizing what he called the Poor People's Campaign, a plan to bring Americans of all races to Washington to demand fairness and opportunity. It was in that spirit that he traveled to Memphis, Tennessee. Sanitation workers there, many of them black men, were on strike. They worked long hours in dangerous conditions for low wages. 2 workers had recently been crushed to death in a malfunctioning garbage truck. The city had offered little response. The workers carried signs that read simply, "I am a man." Dr. King saw their struggle as part of a larger fight. On April 3, 1968, he addressed a crowd at the Mason Temple in Memphis. A storm raged outside. Thunder rolled. Yet the church was filled. His speech that night would later be known as the mountaintop speech. There was something reflective in his tone, something almost prophetic. "I've been to the mountaintop," he said, "and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land." Then he added, "I may not get there with you." Those words would echo across the country less than 24 hours later. On the evening of April 4th, Dr. King stepped onto the balcony. Outside his room at the Lorraine Motel, he was preparing for dinner at a friend's home. At 6:01 p.m., a single rifle shot rang out. The bullet struck him in the neck. He fell backward onto the balcony. Friends and colleagues rushed toward him. Ambulances arrived. He was taken to St. Joseph's Hospital. An hour later, he was pronounced dead. He was 39 years old. The news traveled quickly. Television networks broke into regular programming. Radio announcers spoke in stunned voices. Across the country, people gathered around their televisions, struggling to absorb what had happened. For many Americans, black and white alike, Dr. King had come to represent a moral center in a turbulent time. His commitment to nonviolence had been tested repeatedly, yet he never abandoned it. Now, violence had taken him. Grief soon gave way to anger. In more than 100 cities, unrest erupted. Washington, D.C. saw entire blocks burn. Chicago, Baltimore, Kansas City National Guard units were deployed. Smoke rose over neighborhoods that had long felt overlooked and underserved. The nation seemed to tremble. President Lyndon Johnson addressed the country, calling for calm. He declared a national day of mourning. Flags were lowered to half-staff, but words felt insufficient. The assassination struck at something deeper than politics. It raised a painful question. If a man who preached love, patience, and peaceful change could be silenced by a bullet, what did that say about the state of the nation? On April 9th, Dr. King was laid to rest in Atlanta, Georgia. Thousands lined the streets. Millions watched the funeral procession on television. His casket was carried by a simple mule-drawn wagon, an image meant to reflect his solidarity with the poor as the procession moved slowly forward. Many Americans sensed that an era had ended. The civil rights movement did not disappear. Its work continued. Laws remained in place, but the steady, guiding voice that had shaped its moral direction was gone. And 1968 was only 4 months old. The country had lost one of its most recognizable leaders. 2 months later, another man who spoke of unity and change, would meet a similar fate. The year was not finished testing America. 2 months after the death of Dr. King, the nation was still grieving. Cities were quieter, but the unease had not lifted. The war in Vietnam dragged on. College campuses simmered with protest. Trust in leadership felt fragile. And in the midst of that uncertainty, one man's campaign began to gather momentum. Senator Robert F. Kennedy of New York, younger brother of President John F. Kennedy, former Attorney General. A figure once seen as cautious and calculating had, by 1968, become something different, more reflective, more empathetic. He spoke openly about poverty in America, about racial injustice, about ending the war in Vietnam. To many, he seemed capable of bridging divides. On the night of June 4, 1968, Kennedy won the California Democratic primary, a critical victory in his bid for the presidency. Shortly after midnight, just past 12:15 a.m., he stepped into the embassy ballroom at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles to address supporters. His speech was brief but hopeful. "Now it's on to Chicago," he said, referring to the upcoming Democratic National Convention. The crowd cheered. Moments later, he left the stage, intending to walk through a kitchen pantry as a shortcut to a press conference. In that narrow space, surrounded by campaign aides and hotel staff, gunshots erupted. Chaos followed. Kennedy fell to the floor, wounded in the head. Others nearby were struck as well. Voices shouted. Dishes crashed. Someone cried out for a doctor. Photographs from that night show a busboy kneeling beside him, cradling his head. Kennedy's eyes were open, but distant. He was rushed to Good Samaritan Hospital. Surgeons operated through the early morning hours, but the damage was severe. On June 6, 1968, Robert F. Kennedy died at the age of 40-2. The nation watched in disbelief. It had been less than 5 years since President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Now another Kennedy had fallen, this one while campaigning on a message of reconciliation. For many Americans, it felt as if hope itself had been targeted. Robert Kennedy's appeal had been broad. He spoke to working-class white voters concerned about crime and unrest. He spoke to Black Americans still reeling from Dr. King's death. He spoke to young people disillusioned by the war. He did not promise easy solutions. But he offered something increasingly rare in 1968, a sense that the country could still come together. His funeral train carried his body from New York to Washington, D.C. Along the tracks, thousands gathered, men, women, children standing silently as the train passed. Some saluted, some bowed their heads. Others simply watched, as if unsure what to say. The images were quiet, almost solemn, but beneath that silence was a deeper exhaustion. 2 major political assassinations in 2 months. A war abroad, protests at home. The question lingered. What kind of year was this becoming? With the Democratic National Convention scheduled for August in Chicago, tensions were already building. Anti-war activists planned demonstrations. Party leaders prepared for a contentious gathering. Robert Kennedy might have altered the direction of that convention, perhaps even the election. Without him, the path forward grew more uncertain. As summer approached, the nation stood at a crossroads, and in Chicago, the divisions that had been simmering all year were about to spill into the streets. On live television, by August of 1968, the Democratic Party was deeply divided. President Lyndon Johnson had announced months earlier that he would not seek re-election. The war in Vietnam had fractured his party. After the assassination of Robert Kennedy, Vice President Hubert Humphrey emerged as the likely nominee, but he had not competed in the primaries the way others had. Outside the convention hall in Chicago, thousands of anti-war demonstrators gathered. They were students, activists, veterans, young Americans who believed the political system was failing them. Many felt that their voices had been ignored, that decisions about war and peace were being made without their consent. Mayor Richard J. Daley of Chicago promised to maintain order. Police were deployed in large numbers. The National Guard stood ready. The stage was set for confrontation. During the day, delegates debated inside the International Amphitheater. Speeches were delivered. Party leaders attempted to project unity, but outside, in the parks and streets of Chicago, tensions escalated. Protesters chanted against the war. They demanded an immediate withdrawal from Vietnam. Some sought permits to camp in public parks and were denied. Curfews were imposed. As night fell, the situation grew volatile. On August 26th and again on August 28th, clashes broke out between demonstrators and police. Television cameras captured scenes that stunned viewers across the country. Officers swinging batons, protesters shouting, "The whole world is watching." Tear gas drifting through crowds. Journalists caught in the chaos. What unfolded was later described by a federal commission as a police riot. Inside the convention hall, delegates could hear the commotion outside. Anti-war delegates attempted to challenge the party platform. When Senator Abraham Ribicoff denounced the Gestapo tactics of Chicago police from the convention floor, Mayor Daley was seen shouting back in anger. The divisions were no longer abstract. They were visible. Audible. Unmistakable. For older Americans watching at home, the scenes were deeply unsettling. The country appeared to be coming apart, not just politically, but socially. Authority was questioned. Institutions were challenged. The images of conflict were broadcast nationwide. For younger Americans, the events confirmed what they already suspected, that peaceful protest could be met with force, and that the system resisted change. Hubert Humphrey secured the Democratic nomination, but the convention did not feel triumphant. It felt strained. The Republican Party, meeting earlier that summer in Miami Beach, had nominated Richard Nixon. He campaigned on a promise of restoring law and order. To many voters troubled by what they had seen in Chicago, that message resonated. The Democratic Convention of 1968 did more than choose a candidate. It exposed a generational divide. A divide over the war. A divide over authority. A divide over what kind of country America was becoming. As summer turned toward autumn, the presidential campaign moved forward. Speeches were delivered, promises were made, but the images from Chicago lingered. The chant echoed, "The whole world is watching." And in November, the American people would render their verdict, choosing a new president in a year unlike any other. By late 1968, the divisions in America were no longer confined to politics. They were cultural, generational, personal. At dinner tables across the country, parents and children found themselves struggling to understand one another. The generation that had lived through the Great Depression and fought in World War II believed deeply in duty, order, and national unity. Their sons and daughters were questioning all of it. College campuses had become centers of debate and sometimes confrontation. Students protested not only the war in Vietnam, but also racial inequality, corporate influence, and what they saw as a rigid, unresponsive establishment. Draft notices arrived in mailboxes. Young men faced a decision that would shape their lives: report for service, seek deferment, or resist. For many families, the war was no longer an abstract policy, it was personal. Meanwhile, a broader cultural shift was underway. Music reflected the turbulence of the time. Folk and rock artists sang about peace, civil rights, and disillusionment. Lyrics carried messages that would have seemed radical just a decade earlier. Television brought scenes of protest into living rooms. Newspapers printed photographs of marches, sit-ins, and confrontations with police. There was a sense that the country was arguing with itself, not in cities. Racial tensions remained high following Dr. King's assassination. In suburbs and small towns, many Americans worried about rising crime and social unrest. The phrase law and order became more than a slogan. It became a rallying cry. Yet for others, the call for order sounded like a dismissal of legitimate grievances. The counterculture movement, often associated with long hair, unconventional dress, and communal living, unsettled many older Americans. To some, it symbolized freedom and experimentation. To others, it represented a rejection of tradition and responsibility. The generational divide was not always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, a strained silence at the dinner table, a disagreement that lingered unresolved. Churches, schools, and workplaces all felt the strain. And beneath it all was a deeper uncertainty. What did it mean to be American in 1968? Was it loyalty to institutions? Or was it the courage to challenge them? Was patriotism expressed through service or through protest? These were not easy questions. They did not have simple answers. As the presidential campaign moved toward November, candidates spoke to these divisions in different ways. Some promised stability. Others spoke of change. Many Americans simply longed for calm for a year, without assassinations, without riots, without televised confrontations. But 1968 had already altered the national mood. Trust in government had weakened. Confidence in leadership had been shaken. The sense of shared experience that once united Americans during wartime now felt fragmented. The country was not collapsing, but it was transforming. And transformations, especially rapid ones, can feel unsettling, like standing on shifting ground. As Election Day approached, voters carried with them not just political preferences, but the accumulated weight of a turbulent year. They would soon choose a new president, but whether that choice could mend the fractures of 1968 remained an open question. By the fall of 1968, Americans were tired of war headlines, tired of funeral processions. Tired of protests that ended in smoke and sirens. Presidential campaign moved forward against that. backdrop of exhaustion, Vice President Hubert Humphrey carried the Democratic banner. He was an experienced public servant, long associated with civil rights legislation. Yet he faced a difficult task distancing himself from the Vietnam policies of President Lyndon Johnson while remaining loyal to the administration he served. Richard Nixon, the Republican nominee, had been here before. He had lost the presidency narrowly in 1960. Now he returned with a different tone, calmer, more deliberate. He spoke of restoring stability. He spoke of representing what he called this silent majority, Americans who did not march in the streets or appear on television, but who felt unsettled by the rapid changes unfolding around them. And then there was George Wallace, the former governor of Alabama, running as a third-party candidate. Wallace appealed to voters who felt alienated by both major parties. He criticized federal authority and spoke bluntly about law enforcement and social order. His rallies drew large, energetic crowds. The campaign was not simply about policy. It was about mood. Televised debates were absent that year, but speeches and advertisements carried powerful imagery. Scenes from Chicago lingered in public memory. So did the images from Vietnam. Nixon promised a plan for peace with honor. He did not outline it in detail, but the phrase suggested strength without surrender. For many voters weary of the conflict, it sounded reassuring. Humphrey, late in the campaign, began to distance himself more openly from Johnson's war strategy. His poll numbers improved. The race tightened. Election day arrived on November 5, 1968. Americans went to the polls in record numbers. When the votes were counted, Richard Nixon had won, though, by a narrow margin in the popular vote. George Wallace carried 5 southern states, reflecting the depth of regional and cultural divides. Hubert Humphrey conceded gracefully. For Nixon supporters, the result represented a return to steadiness, a belief that order could be restored, that the turbulence of 1968 might give way to calmer days. For others, the outcome was uncertain. Could one election truly mend the fractures of such a year? The challenges remained. The war in Vietnam continued. Racial tensions persisted. Generational disagreements did not disappear with the closing of the polls, yet there was a quiet shift. Power had changed hands peacefully, as it had throughout American history. Even in a year marked by violence and division, the democratic process had endured. In January 1969, Richard Nixon would place his hand on a Bible and take the oath of office. He inherited a nation bruised, skeptical, and searching for reassurance. 1968 had not broken America, but it had tested it severely. And as the calendar turned, many Americans wondered whether the trials of that year would be remembered as a turning point, or as the beginning of something even more uncertain. Asterisk, when the calendar finally turned to January 1969, there was no sudden sense of relief, no clear dividing line between turmoil and calm. The events of 1968 did not simply fade with the new year. They lingered. The war in Vietnam continued, though now under new leadership. President Richard Nixon spoke of gradual withdrawal, of turning responsibility over to South Vietnamese forces. The phrase Vietnamization entered the national vocabulary, but the conflict was far from over. Casualty reports still appeared in newspapers. Protests did not disappear. In fact, in the years that followed, they would grow even larger. The assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy left lasting spaces in public life that could not easily be filled. Younger leaders emerged, but the moral authority and unifying presence of those figures were difficult to replace. For many Americans, 1968 marked the end of a certain innocence, the belief that progress was inevitable, that institutions would steadily improve, that national leaders could be trusted without question. those assumptions were weakened. Trust in government began a measurable decline. Surveys conducted in the years after 1968 showed growing skepticism. Citizens questioned official statements more readily. Journalists pursued investigations with greater intensity. The credibility gap that had opened during Vietnam did not close. Culturally, the shifts accelerated. Music, film, and literature reflected a more questioning, sometimes darker tone. Young Americans demanded a greater voice in decisions that shaped their futures. Women's rights movements gained new energy. Environmental concerns rose into public debate. The country was changing, not collapsing, but transforming. For those who had lived through World War II and the early years of the Cold War, the changes felt abrupt. For those coming of age in the late 1960s, they felt necessary. And perhaps that is the quiet legacy of 1968. It forced America to confront itself, its promises and its shortcomings, its ideals and its contradictions. The divisions of that year did not vanish. In some ways, they deepened. Political rhetoric grew sharper. Campaigns became more strategic, more media-driven. Appeals to cultural identity became more pronounced. Yet, democracy endured. Despite violence, despite anger, despite grief, power still transferred peacefully. Courts still functioned. Congress still convened. Citizens still voted. 1968 revealed the fragility of unity, but also the resilience of the constitutional system. In hindsight, historians often describe it as a turning point. A year when the post-war consensus fractured, when deference gave way to dissent, when authority began to be questioned openly and persistently. For those who lived through it, the memories remain vivid. The shock of breaking news, the images of smoke over city streets, a sense of uncertainty about what might come next. And yet, life continued. Families gathered for holidays. Children went to school. Businesses opened each morning. The nation did not come apart, but it was forever changed. The long shadow of 1968 stretches across the decades that followed. Its debates echo in later elections. Its questions resurface in times of crisis. It was not simply a year of events, it was a year of reckoning. And in many ways, America is still living with its consequences. When we look back on 1968, it is tempting to see it as a storm loud, violent, and temporary. But it was more than that. It was a mirror. In 12 short months, America witnessed war abroad, assassinations at home, cities in flames, and political conventions that dissolved into confrontation. Trusted leaders were taken. Assumptions were challenged. Certainty gave way to doubt. And yet, the country did not collapse. It bent. It trembled. But it endured. For many who lived through that year, the memories remain sharp. The sound of breaking news interrupting evening television. The sight of funeral trains passing slowly through small towns. The uneasy conversations around kitchen tables. 1968 forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about race, power, war, and generational change. It asked whether unity was still possible in a nation so divided. Some would argue that the divisions of that year never fully healed, that they simply evolved, resurfacing in new forms across the decades. Others would say that 1968 was a painful but necessary reckoning, a moment when long suppressed tensions finally came into the open. Perhaps it was. Both. History rarely offers clean conclusions, but what remains undeniable is this: 1968 reshaped the national character. It marked the end of one era and the uncertain beginning of another, and its echoes are still with us. In the way Americans debate war and peace. In the way citizens question authority. In the way elections are fought and remembered. year that seemed to break America did something else as well. It revealed its resilience, because even in its darkest hours, the nation continued arguing, grieving, rebuilding, and moving forward. And that may be the quiet lesson of 1968. A country can be shaken without being destroyed.